Stay tuned for tonight's adventure with the Fat Man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are because I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and this one stinks. Yeah. Okay. Or reason 276 why I'll never get anything done because everything is a rabbit hole. And this story goes much, much deeper. There are many, many layers to this shit. But there's only so much I could do with so little time. And so have fun with this one, guys. Cheers. Okay. All right. So this one starts because I found a folder that had 3 pages of this Baltimore Sun from Saturday, September 9th, 1845. Now, I can't remember what it was about these pages that had me save them back when I was looking into the Jubilee and everything. But since I found the folder, I was like, well, let me take a look around and see what I can see in here. Right? And I found a couple of really interesting things. And the first of which was I found a series of ads for guano. Where's Mexican guano here? All right. And for mixing with Peruvian guano, right? I found on this next page more ads for Mexican guano here and here. And then even on a third page, I found this one for Peruvian guano, which lists the prices, right? 1 to 5 tons, $53 cash. Now I'm assuming that's per ton. And so $50 in 1850 was like $30, $31. And so it comes out to over $1,500 per ton of guano. And I was like, what the heck is going on with all this guano in Baltimore in the mid 1850s? Right? So I had to look that up. Just scrolling through, I guess it's not a very well kept secret at all because it's in all the major mainstream history publications about the guano trade of the 1800s and how important it was to American imperialism. I found this great article, which is actually it's an interview. It's a transcription of an interview that this guy, Daniel Imherwar, gives to, I love his Dave Davis. There's going to be some Kinks action somewhere along the way, I'm sure. Right, but this is a very long interview in promotion of his book, How to Hide an Empire. And after reading this interview and doing some other little bit of research, that's exactly what they did behind the guano trade. America hid its empire. Or perhaps hid how it's still an extension of the British Empire. Right? And so what I find out pretty early on in this article is that Baltimore is the major hub for the importation and distribution of guano in America through this Baltimore Phosphate company and this Peruvian company, Barrera and Brother. And I found this great article going into the whole thing. All right, load of guano, Baltimore in the fertilizer trade in the 19th century. And this article is really amazing. And so between these articles, they really sort of paint this very bleak picture. And I have like the populations brought up here. All right, so in this period that they're talking about, 1830 to 1850, we go from 4,000 to 50,000. And you fast forward 200 years to 1830, you're at almost 13 million, all right? And it almost doubles in that next 40-year span. And so they paint this bleak picture of American farming and how the soil is really depleted and the crops aren't growing that well, especially with most of the farmland in this time being concentrated on the East Coast, with Western expansion not really taking off until the start of the 19th century. All right. So what I found out about this Baltimore Phosphate Company through this article was that it was owned and operated by one R.W. Raskin. All right, so here he is, R.W.L. Racin of the Baltimore firm, the first Baltimore firm to import guano from Caribbean sources. And now his name is familiar to me because I believe he was affiliated with the Baltimore Burnt District Commission right after the Baltimore Fire in 1904. Now, I know he dies certainly before the Jubilee, and I don't know how long he stays with the Baltimore Burnt District Commission, but that's where his name rings bells for me, is that he was a major player in Baltimore politics and so forth in the latter half of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. And what's interesting about this and how it all happens into Baltimore is essentially like the Navy. I'm not sure if this was a U.S. Navy vessel or not, but this Edward Cooper here, he says one of his crew dies and he finds a deserted island and to bury the guy in, and they find these deposits and claim the island. And the Navy goes along with this, but Haiti, I guess the island, this Navassa island is off the coast of Haiti. The Haitian government complains, but essentially what the U.S. Navy does is says, oh, you want it? Come take it, and of course they can't. And so this starts happening all around the world, really, islands getting claimed as U.S. territories based on their guano production. Now, what's really amazing about this and how it pertains to building the American empire, and so America's acquiring all of these territories, but not really doing much with them other than the fact that they're claimed and the guano production is happening there, right? But then and this goes on for like 50, 60 years or so. And certainly in the Caribbean under the Baltimore Phosphate and then the Navassa Phosphate Company. And now something amazing happens on the island of Navassa and so what these fertilizer companies end up doing to get their workers is, they scoop up whatever freed slave or escaped slave that they can. They promise them the world, fair wage, tropical work environment, and so forth. And I'm sure this applied to all people and not just freed or escaped slaves, but anybody poor enough, desperate enough for work, Sounds pretty good, right? And they get on there and they end up going to all these shit islands and mining guano. But the conditions are terrible and the wages are poor and they're all paid at the end of the term and everything on the island is charged against your wage. So at the end of it, some of these workers end up even owing the companies money for basic services like food and water and things like this, right? It's unbelievable. Right? And there's a rebellion on Navassa Island. The workers overthrow the overseers, kill like 4 or 5 of them, right? But then are promptly arrested and brought back to Baltimore for trial because all of this is still happening out of Baltimore, right? And this is where the imperialism aspect of it comes in because it's during this trial, because now we're post-Civil War here. We're in the late 1800s, early 1900s, right? And so there are Negro charities and things like this, legal defense funds and so forth, and they raise money for a legal defense team that includes the very first black lawyer to receive the bar out of Maryland. His defense is that these workers cannot be tried because Navassa Island and these other guano territories are not part of the United States. And so what the Supreme Court is forced to do is to recognize these territories as constitutionally protected. Right? And in doing so, allows the trial for these workers. They do get sentenced to death penalty, but the uproar is so great that it's just reduced to hard labor. Right? But it sets a precedent that these territories, and some of them are quite large. I mean, the Philippines becomes one. Puerto Rico, that's how Puerto Rico becomes an American territory. And I'm going to talk about that in a second too, because this story gets really crazy. And with how it could even be connected today. All right, so now the U.S. has all of these territories, and they get to be willy-nilly about which ones are constitutionally protected, which ones aren't, who's going to have the right to vote, and so forth. But there is a movement in the United States at the time to change the name of the United States because people are realizing that with these territories, it's no longer what the Constitution set out to do, right? It's now something else. It is an empire, right? These are imperialistic tendencies happening, right? So they want to change the name. Right? So there is some movement to make that happen, but Congress is able to skirt around that by again being willy-nilly about which territories are and aren't acceptable. And this goes on through to the end of World War II, where America pretty much gives up most of those territories, but it does maintain something like Puerto Rico and the Philippines and the U.S. Virgin Islands and stuff. All of this comes out of this guano trade. But a really amazing aspect of the story is something that comes along a bit later after Baltimore's involvement and into the 20th century, and I have to dig for it here. This is a long interview, so hold on. So late in the interview, they're talking about America's involvement in Puerto Rico, its occupation or whatever the heck it was doing in Puerto Rico after World War I, right? And the guy mentions that there's a fascinating part of the story that he never heard about before, the American doctor Cornelius Rhodes, right? And so who the interviewer says was working on the island in public health to alleviate disease. And so our historian here, Immerwar, he recalls the story of Cornelius Rhodes as a doctor working for the Rockefeller Institute who goes to Puerto Rico to do experiments and study anemia. All right, but he's an abject racist. He's unbelievably racist. And not only that, he takes eugenics into his own hands as well. And he writes a letter back to a friend of his in Boston where he says, the Puerto Ricans, they're dirty, they're thieving, they're one of the worst races that inhabits the planet. And the best thing to do And the best thing to do for Puerto Rico, he says, would be to totally exterminate the population. And then he says to his colleague in Boston, to whom he's writing, I've started that already. I've killed 8 of my patients, and I've tried to transplant cancer into 13 more, although none of them have died yet. Right? And he says it's a chatty letter. He's just writing to his buddy in Boston about all these things that were happening, right? And Puerto Ricans take exception to this, of course. And, so the Rockefeller Institute spirits Rhodes out of there, but not before there's evidence destroyed of some of these experiments and what the heck Dr. Rhodes may have been doing in Puerto Rico, right? So he goes back to New York. He never faces trial or anything like that. And he goes on to become the vice president of the New York Academy of Medicine, right? He's inducted in the Army in World War II, where he serves as chief medical officer in the Chemical Warfare Service. And then after the war, he's a pioneer in chemotherapy, which I think is amazing, right? And so because that ties it back to Antoine Béchamp and Pasteur and things like this, right? And the American Oncology Association or whatever names an award after him, right? And it's not until did I bring it up? And so I just looked into it a little bit, right? Cornelius P Rhodes, right? And they talk about the tainting of the award, and so the Oncology Times here talks about the award and how they're gonna not give it out in this year. I think this is 2003, and they're gonna rename it. And there's a lot of this kind of thing going on with the changing of awards. In the fantasy and science fiction world, there's a big deal about H.P. Lovecraft and his racist tendencies, and their major award was named after him, and it was a bust of his head, and all of that's changed in that literary world as well. Really amazing a story, especially because I remember the ad that I saw. One of the Mexican guano ads was for Rhodes and Son. And so I have to wonder, Cornelius Rhodes, studying in Puerto Rico, which was heavy in guano deposits. There's a Rhodes and Son family in Baltimore pushing Mexican guano. I don't know how much of a coincidence that could be. And also one thing about it, too, is, what does it say about what American soil could be like today for its agriculture, especially along the East Coast? If it was depleted so quickly in 200 years with populations rising up to 25 million or more by the 1850s, what is it like these last, 170, 80 years, where now there's almost 350 million in America today, and what that could say about that. But one other aspect of it, especially with the Peruvian angle of it, and of also tying it into Baltimore and the extension of the empire, because that's, what so much of this information coming to me has been, that sort of staged the American Revolution here out of Baltimore, and that America is really still just a part of the British Empire, and that another way for the British Empire to grow in sort of covert imperialism is through America and these territories, which, again, as I said, America still has many of them. But one thing, tying that story into like the Calverts and the mining aspect of it, because as I said, so much of, if there was elements of the city that were buried in some sort of catastrophe and things had to be dug out, and that's part of what the colonization of America was, these charter crews coming out to recover, reclaim what could be here. Who's to say that this isn't just a problem reaction solution for them digging out ancient artifacts in Peru and some of these other places? Because what's in Peru but Machu Picchu's in Peru, and Tiahuanaco, and all of these other ancient megalithic sites. Who's to say they were just digging all of these things out of bird and bat poop? I don't know. They needed a market to get rid of all this stuff that they had. Oh, let's create an agriculture scare and make everybody buy our fertilizer. I don't know. It's certainly one way to look at it, whether correct or not. I thought this was a really fun little story, especially as it pertains to building of an American empire, which could really still just be a connection of the British Empire, considering what you and I know about the families of Maryland and Baltimore and their connections to the crown and so forth. Okay, and so to wrap this one up with a couple of quick cherries, when I was, like I said, I didn't know why I had these saved. And so when I was looking through, I found this article, which is really amazing. It says, lighting the streets. Right, the streets of New York City are now kept lighted by gas lamps every night, without regard to the aspect of the firmament and the changes of the moon, without regard for the aspect of the firmament. 1854, Baltimore Sun. All right, there's that one. But then to continue on down the same column, unbelievable. Where is it? The remains of Edgar Allan Poe, a writer in the St. Louis Republican, lately stated, were still reposing in an obscure corner of Potter's Field of Baltimore. Thus, the Patriot states, is incorrect, as they were interred at the time of his death in the First Presbyterian churchyard on the corner of Green and Fayette Streets, and were followed to the grave by a large number of relatives and friends. And now this Presbyterian churchyard on Green and Fayette Streets is where they say he's buried today. And Mary and I have gone there, and it's probably closed now. So I do have some footage and pictures and stuff. I might have to bust that out and do an episode now that this is here, because they're talking about the remains of Edgar Allan Poe. This is September 9th. 1845. Edgar Allan Poe died October 7th, 1849. How on earth? Where is it? How are they talking about his interred remains in 1845 September? More than 4 years. That is unbelievable. That's absolutely crazy. Okay. All right, so I'm going to wrap this one up here. Remember, guys, just because you don't know the truth doesn't mean you can't have fun with the lie. Until the next one, cheers.